Hey there, and welcome to the Sudo Show, brought to you by the Destination Linux Network. Today, we'll share with you the most common security myths of open source, debunk them live on air, and talk about how the industry is working to correct these issues. All that and more on this episode of the Sudo Show. Welcome to the Sudo Show, your home for all things enterprise open source. I'm Eric, the IT guy, and joining me every episode is my inspired co-host, Brandon Johnson. How you doing today, buddy?
Doing all right, Eric. How are you?
Oh, it's just another day in paradise. I don't know. That's all I got.
Yeah, it's been a week. So, but let's go and dive right into this.
Yeah, I'm with you right there. Let's dive in and get into our topic.
Today's episode of the Sudo Show is brought to you by none other than Bitwarden. Bitwarden is the easiest and safest way for individuals, teams, and businesses to store, share, and sync sensitive data. You can go to bitwarden.com/DLN to check out their amazing service. You may or may not know that websites and apps are under attack every day, and because of this, security breaches occur. When you reuse the same passwords across multiple websites, hackers thank you because they can easily access your email, banks, and other important accounts. This is why security experts recommend that you use a different, randomly generated password for every online account. With Bitwarden, you can create these randomly generated passwords that are different for every site you visit. And the best part is Bitwarden will manage all of this for you so you don't have to. Bitwarden works across your devices from mobile, desktop, browser plugins, and even on the command line. When you make the smart move and go check out bitwarden.com/DLN and get started for free. If you're like me, though, you'll want to access all that Bitwarden has to offer with the premium edition, especially since the premium edition starts at only $10 per year. That's right, $10 per year. Go to bitwarden.com/DLN and thank you, Bitwarden, for sponsoring the Sudo Show and the entire Destination Linux Network.
Today's episode is brought to you by our friends over at DigitalOcean. DigitalOcean recently announced their new Managed MongoDB service, which is a fully managed database as a service. With Managed MongoDB, you can focus more on building scalable, high-performance apps and less on maintaining the database. DigitalOcean built this service in partnership with MongoDB Inc., and together they've ensured that you will get access to all the latest releases of the Mongo database as they become available. As a listener of the Sudo Show podcast and a member of the DLN community, you can get started for free. Actually, better than free, because DigitalOcean is giving you a $100 credit when you go to do.co/DLN-Mongo. Need more than just a database? You can use your $100 credit to try out all the amazing services DigitalOcean has to offer. Again, go to do.co/DLN-Mongo to get started with your $100 free credit on DigitalOcean's new Managed MongoDB. And thank you to DigitalOcean for sponsoring the Sudo Show and the entire Destination Linux Network.
I'm going to say something that I know will be controversial with the open source community and this audience. And it's bomb, but I actually think open source software has just as many security vulnerabilities as proprietary software. And before you object and tell me I'm wrong, there's software's written by humans and humans make mistakes. Whether if you're talking about proprietary software or open source software, it's still, as far as I'm aware, written by people. So, just to kick off this episode of debunking open source security myths, I'm just going to put that out there right now. What do you think about that, Eric?
It's clickbaity. It's controversial. I like it. But if you break down what you said, and I had to be clear about this before you started, you're saying that open source software has just as many vulnerabilities, to the best that we can tell, as proprietary software. So I will agree, if you get past that knee-jerk reaction as an open source enthusiast that, no, you cannot tell me that open source technology has vulnerabilities. No. Once you get past that knee-jerk reaction and think about it, it's true. But You absolutely hit the nail on the head that open source software has issues. It has vulnerabilities, it has bugs, just like the proprietary version. The advantage, though, of being an open source product or project, whichever the case may be, and having a community and a team of developers and a global culture of working on code and making things better, whether it's a project that you're passionate about or a project that you just happen to stumble upon where you found a bug and you're reporting it. The advantage is the number of eyes. Wish I knew who said this originally. I've heard it quoted many times, but with many eyes, any bug is shallow. That might have actually been Linus Torvalds himself. But the more people that you have looking and working on your project, the quicker those bugs come to light, the easier that they can be identified and remediated and fixed back into the production code. So, yeah, definitely would have to agree.
Yeah, granted, like with open source, like any industry expert, security experts can just dive in and look at code. I mean, one of the sponsors of the show, Bitwarden, their code is 100% open source and is regularly audited by security experts, which I think a lot more open source projects need to do that, especially ones that run critical infrastructure across the planet. But that still doesn't mean that there isn't problems, and that's really all I really wanted to how I wanted to frame this. It's not just about eyes; it's also like keeps going back to. I keep harping on this, and I'm going to get known as open source supply chain nerd, but it's all about the supply chain and like one piece of a piece of software that's insecure, it's a domino effect. Just that, one library can be used in several hundred or even thousand open source projects, and it impacts systems all over the globe.
Well, I don't think Brandon, the open source supply chain guy, as nice a ring as Eric, the IT guy, does, but we'll work on it. We'll wordsmith that a bit and get back to you.
All right.
That's actually our first and probably the most common myth that we see in technology is that open source is more secure. When you look at it from an inherent perspective, no, it's not more secure. There's just more eyes. Usually has a faster time to light on any particular issue. But that's probably the one I hear about the most. The second one, and this one has gotten a lot of controversy as of late, and that is that free means it's cheap. And we can actually take this from two different perspectives. The first is that free means that it's cheap. Everyone has heard the phrase "you get what you pay for." If you don't pay for software, that must mean that it's garbage. When we wrote the script for this, I actually thought of a second kind of a sub myth, if you will, that free means cheap, in the fact that if you use free software in the enterprise, that you're saving money. That's not necessarily true. I mean, would you take your car down to Joe 3 houses down because he watches a American car restoration TV show and get your oil changed for free, or would you rather take it to someone who's licensed and certified by standards organizations to manage your software? So there's two different ways we can tackle this, Brandon. Which one really resonates with you?
Yeah, they kind of both do. I mean, like from free equals cheap, you still have to pay for it somewhere, right? Let's not take the Linux operating system. Let's take something a little people that think of less. Let's actually take like open source libraries that don't necessarily have a company behind them, that just get maintained by someone as part-time, or maybe they do work for a large corporation, but that library just happens to be open source and they're using it somewhere in one of their products or an internal IT application. And we see this starting to happen all the time with like Silicon Valley companies like Lyft and Uber, Facebook, of course, Google putting out a lot of their code that they use internally. So let's stick with a library. These libraries get used. Now you need to, not only do you need to start helping to maintain that library, so you have to hire someone that understands it. So this is my perspective on this. I mean, this comes back to a give back versus just the take in open source. But if you're going to build an application and you're going to start relying on specific libraries, you need to start owning that technical debt. And that includes helping maintain those projects. That's one of the things that I think will help keep open source secure, if not make it even more secure than proprietary software, if more companies that leverage free libraries in their enterprise software and contribute. Actually, and things else, I'll probably even go back to that. I'll just contribute with code. I keep coming back to this. Contribute with money, right? Interviewed the folks from Tidelift. We've talked about of other ways of pushing money to projects. Money speaks. Money keeps people engaged. A lot of libraries just die on the vine because maintainers decide to quit. And then that leaves a hole in the open source supply chain. Because what I've noticed is even after a library dies, like it's not maintained for years, I've seen libraries being utilized in major open source projects. And I'm like, why is this still here? It's not being maintained anymore. But there's no replacement for it. So like, in a way, now that I say that, in a way, open source can be more vulnerable than proprietary software in that regard, because then it impacts more. I mean, like goes back, like if you use a common library and it stops getting developed, how many open source projects could that impact? Is it just one? Is it 100? So that's one of the things that I think about all the time when investing in an open source project, whether that's my time, like dumping code into it, or just implementing it. What does that look like? But what pieces are in the code that are being maintained and are not. That's the stuff that keeps me up at night as a technologist and as a technology leader.
To tie it back into the main point, I think free means cheap. The reality is, how do you want to pay for your software? Is that in picking up the technical debt for an open source library that may or may not be getting actively supported? Is that by paying a company like Tidelift, who can then pay the developer to ensure that we keep coming back to Tidelift, don't we?
Yeah.
Not to go down that rabbit trail. I mean, they are unique in what they do. Or to pay a vendor for a pre-built product that then looks at those libraries and decides which one matches the needs of the customer problem the closest, and then they take on the technical debt or they hire the developer. We've talked about ways to contribute to open source early on in this show. Companies like SUSE and Red Hat are very well known for sort of adopting either projects or even adopting developers for projects and giving them a badge and a paycheck and say, this particular project is critical to the internet infrastructure, so we're going to pay you to continue to maintain it. So it really is, you're going to pay for the software that you use one way or the other. These free operating systems or free libraries, things like that, you're going to end up paying for them one way or the other. It's a question of where do you want to pay that debt? Do you have an excess of talent on your team? Then by all means, help a project out, because you'll be helping make the internet safer across the board by helping take on some of that technical debt. If you have an excess of budget that you're willing to throw some money at an open source project, then do that. It's what do you have that you can use to pay for that software, whether it's for a license or giving back in a different way.
Keeps coming back to scalability. Maintainers, got to eat. So
are we sure? Is that confirmed?
I'm pretty sure maintainers are still people, so they need to eat.
It hasn't been absorbed by Skynet just yet.
Yeah, it's about maintaining. It's about finding it. I mean, it's not just like, oh, a specific thing gets exploited. Like when I think about security, I don't just think about Heartbleed. I think about everything down the chain, right? I mean, like, or something like Heartbleed. I got to think of everything down the chain. I mean that was a huge problem, but
before you hold on to your thought, I think we should kind of define what we're talking about here. It's funny, during our show prep, we realized that Heartbleed actually came out in 2014, and that was in technology years, that was a really long time ago. But the results of technology culture impact of Heartbleed, I think, really still rings in people's ears today. So just to kind of define what Heartbleed was a vulnerability in the heartbeat communication between a client and a web server. It had to do with validating the size of the heartbeat packet. So when you open up a web page and you got an active session, what happens is your browser will occasionally send a packet to that web page that says, "Hey, I'm still here. Keep the connection open." And there was a vulnerability within OpenSSL, within TLS and SSL, that allowed a bad actor to manipulate the size of the heartbeat package, which could then crash the web server. And well, not so much crash the web server, but it could compromise the integrity of the web server and grant a bad actor access to do some pretty much more nefarious things. And at the time that Heartbleed was discovered, it affected over 17% of all the SSL servers on the internet. If Heartbleed were to have come out today, I think that number would have been dramatically higher. If you look at the OpenSSL project back in 2014, think about this. OpenSSL drives just about every piece of encrypted traffic on the internet. You know how big their team was in 2014 when this vulnerability came out? There was 11 developers, and they had an annual budget of $1 million. $1 million, 11 people to basically keep the entirety of internet traffic secure. That just seems pretty rough. But you know what happened? When Heartbleed was discovered, it was actually fixed by members of the community, people that were auditing the OpenSSL package and were actually able to figure out a way to fix the issue. It was basically just a health check that was overlooked when building the OpenSSL package. So it was a fairly easy fix. But this kind of goes back to your statement at the beginning, Brandon, of how if this were proprietary software, we would have had to wait for OpenSSL Inc. or whatever that company would be called to actually retask their resources to go in and find this vulnerability and fix it. Whereas with open source, as far as vulnerabilities are concerned, Heartbleed did a lot of damage, but it was also very short-lived, just because once there were eyes on it, it was fixed very, very quickly.
There are lots of eyes on it, but it could have easily have been as well like some obscure library that just went unmaintained. From my perspective, that was lucky because there's just something that got missed.
Well, where you say luck, I see the power of the open source community.
Yeah. We got lucky that it wasn't like a lot of code that needed to be replaced.
Oh, okay. I gotcha.
Right. I mean, we got lucky that it wasn't an unmaintained library that would cause the issue. That wasn't the case. Like, relatively speaking, I mean, like, I'm sure it was pretty hard to fix, but it was, in terms of like, oh, we got to replace this. It's like replace the library. That would have been a lot harder.
You're alluding to an abandoned library where you can't find the original maintainer. They didn't pass on the keys of the kingdom to anyone else, so no one can make any changes. So basically, anyone that uses that library would then have to fork the code, find the problem themselves, fix it, and then redeploy it into an upstream application.
Yeah, I was reading this a couple of weeks ago. I'll make sure the link in the articles in the show notes. That means 60% of maintainers abandon their projects. That's a huge amount of people deciding, I'm not going to maintain this anymore. If you become dependent on that, from my perspective, that's a recipe for security vulnerability. I mean, it goes back to the no support thing, right? Of open source. If you don't pay for it, in a way, it's you get what you pay for. Pick a library that's no longer maintained. That's on you. It's not on anyone else. It's not on your vendors. It's not on. It's maybe on your developers. They probably selected it, but it's also on the CIO for not and CTOs for not checking it. It's on the security team for not looking at the health of the project. This is the stuff I worry about every single day. It's not about bad guys looking at the OpenSSL code. That doesn't keep me up at night. Yeah, you may find a bug in there, but is it really exploitable? There are hundreds of bugs in code, but are they exploitable? I don't know what the statistics are on that, like how many bugs are actually exploitable. But if the bugs are actually exploitable, that's not a big deal. What keeps me up at night is code that goes unmaintained for actually, I'm not even going to say years. I'm going to say months. That's what keeps me up at night. I'm not worried about large open source projects. I'm worried about the smaller projects that the larger projects use.
So we kind of touched on a lot of these. We talked about how open source is not inherently more secure. We talked about free, meaning it's cheap. We kind of talked about that a couple of different ways. One of the myths that we could probably just kind of laugh and move on is that open source code is developed by amateurs. Strangely enough, though, the funny thing was I kind of almost marked this off of our list to talk about, but then I actually heard someone the other day, a technologist, someone well respected in the industry, just said that, yeah, I can't use open source because, it's just a bunch of tinkerers. It's like, oh, I hadn't heard that one in a while, but I figured that one deserved an honorable mention.
Well, I'm gonna respond to that. I mean, that can't be further from the truth.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, maybe like some piece of software, like a note-taking application, right? Maybe, yeah, that's done by an amateur. Yeah, just doing it for fun. The vast majority of open source software used in enterprise is not done by a 16-year-old high school student. It is done by professionals working at IBM, Red Hat, SUSE, Canonical, Cloudera. It's the top open source projects in the world.
Well, you left off a huge chunk of the open source development that's going on nowadays. Companies like Netflix, Uber, Google. I mean, these companies, Google being the exception to that list, that are not predominantly software vendors, but they have begun to release either their processes like Pinterest or their code like Netflix.
Yeah, I did bring that up earlier. I mean, like the Silicon Valley companies like Facebook, Uber, they're putting out awesome code that's being used everywhere. Jaeger, used in the container space, that is heavily used by many Kubernetes projects, even not Kubernetes. I mean, it's built for containers, for trace routing and containers, but it is not done by amateurs by any means. The Linux kernel is done by some of the best professionals in the world. I had a debate on this in 2006. And when I set out to do my career back then, it was actually the year before in 2005, I made a conscious decision that I was going to bet my career on free and open source software. I'm pretty sure I won that bet. And I don't regret it for a single second. And it's simply because open source is won. I know in the interview with Tidelift, we talked about a company that didn't think they were using open source software anywhere. It turned out it was everywhere. I mean, and if you think that you're not, you're wrong. You're using it every day. And the security of that software is not just the maintainer's responsibility, it is yours. If you're using it in mission critical systems, whether that's like processing credit cards or maintaining patient data, it is your responsibility to maintain it. So that's my PSA for the week.
So, I mean, we could talk about a few of these other myths, but I feel like, especially in the past few years, that a lot of them are just so ridiculous that they're not even worth talking about, maybe just mentioning, like the idea that open source software can't scale. Of course, we talked a bit about how bad guys can see the bugs in your code. Well, so can thousands of developers across the world. We could debate the lack of support. We kind of touched on that. One of the things that we've noticed over the course of this show is we've found that there is now an urgent need to fix the open source supply chain. And we talked for quite some time about doing a myth-busting episode about something. And we've been talking a lot about security lately and the open source supply chain. One of the things that inspired recording this episode was, so not too long ago, Google, in partnership with the Open Source Security Foundation, OSSF, our acronyms just keep getting worse, don't they, Brandon?
Yeah, they do.
Google and the OSSF actually partnered on releasing almost a scanner that will evaluate the health of your project and will actually produce a health report and even provide you with a badge that you can attach to your project to ensure that you have to publicize to people using your project that you've complied with this, almost like a scorecard. So Brandon, you came across this the other day. You want to go into a little bit more depth?
Yeah, so what it does is it kind of analyzes the project, and like you can also just, and also some of the results are published, but the scorecard can actually just look at a repo and go, what's kind of the, based off of code reviews, number of contributors, how active it is, how often it does CI tests, etc. There's lots of criteria, but like for example, is it active? I believe the scoring is from 1 to 10. If your project is very active, it's getting regular contributions, you're going to get a 10. I bet if I haven't ran it against an inactive repo, I could probably put it against one of mine, and it'll probably say it's a 0 or a -10.
Be careful, you may end up getting yourself banned off of GitHub.
Oh, whatever. So it looks at a lot of things like what's how many signed releases have you had? How many? There's lots of criteria here. Like one of the ones that they give an example of is Kubernetes. What's the security policy? In this case, I got a fail of 10 in this example. I don't know if that's really still the case. Or code review. You got a pass of 10 because there's so much code review that happens. It's active, so it gets a pass with a score of 10. I think this is really important stuff to know about any project that you use. Run it again. This is something that it will be in the show notes. I think this is really important to know the current health of a project.
A point of clarification here, mostly because it's not readily apparent in the article, but is this something that I, as, say, random Joe developer that works for company X, is trying to develop an application, and I come across a library that I think matches my requirements? Can I, as someone who just clones that repository, run this tool against that, or is this something that has to be done from the maintainer perspective on their repo?
So, based on what I understand, is that you can run this against any repo. You don't have to be the maintainer.
Perfect. If I'm the CIO of a company, I would almost require this tool at this point before you include anything. I mean, instead of just saying, no, we're not using any libraries, but these like 6 or 7 most popular or anything, I would almost set a requirement that before you include an open source project in our product that we're going to sell to customers, they have to have a certain score in certain areas, or at least be trending upwards.
Yeah.
If we have $1 million product, you're not going to bring an open source project, an open source library with a score of -7 and put it into our product that we tell our customers is secure and is going to take care of their data.
Exactly. I mean, and we'll talk about this in a later episode in more detail, but there's also, I don't know if I want to call it a tool, but definitely something that I would want to reference to get a good bird's eye view of a project. And this is LFX Insights. This is a Linux Foundation project that takes a look at several open source foundations and projects. So, for example, like Ceph, like how many contributors there are to it, how many lines of code, where are they pulling this data, and it will say, and it gives you a very similar scorecard. How active is the project, things like that. This is something I want to I'll get deeper into with Eric in a future episode, or even maybe some other content later down the road. But this is something that I think is really important when trying to understand the health of a project and potentially the security health of a project as well, not just its general technical health.
And then a second resource that we'd like to provide, this will also be in the show notes, is it's an article published on Linux.com by the editorial staff talking about how to measure the health of open source communities. It starts out by talking about the importance of metrics, but then it starts to look at how to evaluate the health of It mentions LFX Insights, and it talks about how to measure the financial, the technical, and community health of a project. We'll include that in the show notes. And like Brandon said, this is sticking our foot in the door of some upcoming content that we have in mind to do, and some conversations we're hoping to bring in interviewees to discuss, because this supply chain vulnerability issue isn't just a SolarWinds thing. That was just one of many issues that have come to light over the past 12 months that have really brought it home to folks like Brandon and myself that this is a problem, and it's only getting worse, and we need to address how to fix some of these issues. We've talked about how to fix it from a developer and maintainer perspective, but there's also steps that you can take as a developer or as an end user in a company to basically ensure that your upstream dependencies like open source libraries are secure, and things like the initiatives that the Linux Foundation is taking, as well as this new product by Google, or this new project by Google, I should say, are trying to address. This was just kind of an entertaining look at some of the issues that non-technologists think is faces the open source community, but the reality is much more serious. So if you take anything away from this episode, take a look at the Scorecard project, and we'd love to hear your feedback. We'd love to hear what you think. Brandon, before we wrap up, do you have any other closing thoughts?
No, I think I gave my PSA, and I think people might start getting sick of me saying it, but this stuff's important, and I can't emphasize it enough. If you're a maintainer, figure out a way to monetize. I mean, that's and stay engaged, because quite frankly, we like what you do, and we want you to keep going. And in terms of monetization, if you're an open source maintainer, go to opencollective.com, create what they call a collective. Let them handle the legalese stuff for you. They'll manage the whole thing for you. I think that's one of the big barriers for this. And then as well as Tidelift. I mean, we've brought them on the show before. I mean, there's no sponsorship here, but if you're a maintainer and you have and you think you have a library that is really important, that whether that's your organization that's using it or someone else that is using, some other organizations using it, Tidelift, I think, would be a great way to monetize your work. And also, the greater DLN community is also here to help. Maybe not necessarily from a monetization standpoint, but from a feedback standpoint. Make sure to go to DLN forum, and if you need feedback on your project, we have a great community over there that can get you the additional feedback you may need.
We'll have links to all of this and more in the show notes. And on behalf of myself and Brandon, the open source supply chain guru guy, we're still wordsmithing that. We just want to say thank you so much for joining us today. As always, your feedback is welcome. Head on over to sudo.show/discuss. If you'd like more of Brandon and I, you can find it over at sudo.show or on social media at Sudo Show Podcast. You can catch more awesome content over at our network partners, destinationlinux.network. Brandon, anywhere else you'd like to send folks?
You can follow me on Twitter at dbrandonjohnson or at my website, open-tech.net.
And you can follow me at itguyeric or on itguyeric.com. Remember, the Sudo Show is your place for all things enterprise open source. Until next time.